The night was colder than usual, and the wind carried the scent of dust, hay, and fear. The moonlight spilled through broken clouds, painting the barnyard in silver and shadow. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled, and the horses inside the corral stirred uneasily. The land had seen blood before, but tonight it would remember more than just violence. It would remember justice. 3 men stumbled through the mud, their boots heavy and their breaths ragged. Between them was a young woman, her wrists bound, her dress torn at the shoulder, where one of them had grabbed too hard. She fought to keep her footing, her eyes wild with terror, yet there was something burning behind them, a fire that refused to die. The men muttered to each other, their words slurred with whiskey and arrogance. They thought this was just another night, another cruel act done under the silence of an empty prairie. They didn't know someone was already watching them. Someone who had been waiting. The barn loomed, ahead an old wooden structure, leaning against time itself. Its roof was dark, its doors half open, swaying softly in the wind. The flickering lantern in one man's hand threw nervous light across the hay, glinting off the pitchforks and ropes hanging from the beams. They didn't notice the faint sound of breathing inside, steady and calm. Like that of a hunter who already knew the outcome of the hunt, the young woman stumbled again, falling to her knees in the dirt just before the entrance. One man cursed and yanked her up by the arm, his voice echoing in the quiet. "Move, or I'll drag you the rest of the way." She looked back over her shoulder, her eyes meeting the horizon where the moon sat low and heavy. For a moment, it felt like the earth itself was holding its breath. The leader of the 3 spat to the side and laughed. "Ain't no one out here to help you, girl. Might as well stop fighting." His words came with a cruel satisfaction, the kind that came from power unchecked. But as the barn door creaked open wider, a faint scent of smoke and cedar filled the air. Something ancient, something that didn't belong to these men. Inside, the darkness waited, thick and unmoving. They pushed her in first, their boots crunching on straw, the lantern light bouncing across the wooden walls. The men laughed again, though quieter now. It was as if even the shadows were warning them to keep silent. The woman's breathing came fast, her heart hammering in her chest. Every instinct screamed that something was wrong, not just with the men behind her, but with the silence ahead. The man holding the lantern lifted it higher. "Where's that rope? Let's finish this." His voice cracked slightly. Maybe it was the cold, or maybe it was something else. The flame flickered, casting a quick flash across the far corner of the barn, just enough to show the faint outline of someone standing there. A man, bare-chested, his skin painted with the earth, his eyes glowing like the fire of the desert sun. The Apache warrior didn't move. He stood between the bales of hay, silent as stone, holding a blade in one hand and a calmness that unsettled even the bravest of hearts. His long hair framed his face, his presence filling the barn like a storm before it breaks. The lantern trembled in the man's grip as the flame wavered. The woman gasped softly. She had seen him before only once, from a distance, weeks ago, when the settlers had crossed the river and claimed this land. The whispers in town had called him a ghost, a spirit of vengeance who walked the night when injustice was done. Some said he was the last of his people, hiding among the hills. Others said he was something more, something that couldn't be killed by bullets or fear. The men didn't know what to make of him. "What the hell?" one muttered, reaching for the rifle slung on his shoulder. But before his hand touched it, the Apache spoke, his voice low and even. "Leave her." There was no threat in the words, just command. Simple, final, the leader sneered. "You don't tell me what to do, savage." He took a step forward, trying to sound braver than he felt. The barn seemed to close in on them, the air heavy with tension. The horses outside kicked their stalls, their hooves pounding against the boards. The wind howled through the cracks in the roof, making the lantern light shake wildly. The Apache didn't move. "You crossed the river," he said, his tone still calm. "You burned the land. Now you take what is not yours again." His eyes flicked toward the woman for just a heartbeat, then back to the men. "No more." The man with the rifle laughed nervously. "We ain't scared of you." But the tremor in his hand said otherwise. The lantern caught the glint of the Apache's blade again, a hunting knife, worn smooth by time and blood. Not the weapon of someone new to killing, The woman backed away slowly, her body trembling, torn between fear and relief. She didn't know who this man truly was, or why he was here. But for the first time that night, she felt like the earth had stopped spinning against her. Still, danger hung in the air, thick as smoke. The leader barked an order, and the men spread out, circling the barn like wolves too proud to retreat. The Apache stayed where he was, watching their every move. His breathing didn't change. He was waiting for something for them to make the first mistake. The woman pressed herself against the wooden wall, her mind racing. If they attacked, she would be caught in the middle. But if she ran, where would she go? The land outside was empty and merciless. The first man lunged forward. The barn erupted into motion, the crack of a rifle. The sudden burst of flame as the lantern fell to the ground, spilling oil across the hay. The fire caught fast, racing along the dry straw, climbing toward the beams above. The air filled with heat and smoke. Horses screamed in the distance. The Apache moved like lightning, a blur of motion through the smoke. The knife flashed once, then twice, and one of the men cried out before falling into the straw. The woman ducked down, covering her face as sparks flew around her. Through the haze, she could see the warrior's eyes sharp, focused, not wild but controlled, as if every move had already been decided before the fight began. The leader stumbled back, coughing, his hand pressed against his side. "You'll die for this," he shouted, but his words drowned beneath the roar of the flames. The Apache turned slowly toward him, the fire reflecting in his eyes. He didn't answer. He didn't need to. Outside, the wind picked up, bending the flames backward, spreading them toward the door. The woman crawled toward the light, choking on the smoke. She didn't know if the Apache was following or still fighting behind her. The night was a blur of sound shouts, gunfire. The cracking of wood as the barn began to give way, when she finally stumbled out into the open air. The moon had disappeared behind clouds. The cold hit her lungs like ice, and she collapsed onto the dirt. For a moment, she thought she heard footsteps behind her, soft, steady, coming closer. She turned her head, her eyes searching the shadows. All she could see was the glow of the burning barn, the silhouettes moving within it, and the faint shape of the warrior standing against the firelight, unmoving as if carved from the flames themselves. The night was silent except for the distant rumble of thunder. Somewhere deep inside her, she knew this wasn't the end of her story. The land had taken too much from too many, and tonight, it had awakened something fierce in return. The fire roared higher, and she whispered through cracked lips, not sure if she was speaking to herself or to him. "Who are you?" The answer came only as a shadow passing between her and the light, a silent promise that the night's vengeance had only just begun. The flames from the barn burned through the night, lighting up the valley like a warning. Smoke curled toward the stars, carrying the bitter scent of fear and justice mixed together. The young woman sat on the edge of the field, her arms wrapped around her knees, shivering not from cold, but from shock. She could still hear the crack of gunfire and the cries that followed. Every sound was burned into her memory. When dawn came, the world was quiet again, too quiet for what had just happened. She looked toward the ashes of the barn, the ground still glowing faintly from the heat. The Apache was gone. No trail, no sign of him, just the faint prints in the dirt that led toward the hills. It was as if he had vanished back into the land that birthed him. But his presence still lingered, heavy in the air, as if the earth itself was whispering his name. She didn't even know it, yet somehow she felt that he had saved her not by chance, but by purpose. The sun rose slow, casting gold light across the empty prairie. In the distance, she could see the outlines of the towns, small, dusty, and still half asleep. She thought about going back, but what would she say? That 3 men tried to harm her, and that a warrior from the hills had killed them. No one would believe her. They would twist the story, call her a liar, or worse, blame her for what happened. That was how things worked here. The truth didn't matter when fear and prejudice ran deeper than justice. She pushed herself up and began walking. Her bare feet sank into the cold earth as the wind brushed against her hair. The trail toward town was long, winding through dry grass and broken fences. Every step felt heavier than the last. Somewhere behind her, the crows had already begun circling over the burnt remains. By midday, she reached the edge of the settlement. A few weathered buildings, saloon, a church, and a handful of ranch houses scattered across the plains. People stopped and stared as she passed, their eyes sharp with curiosity and judgment. An old woman from the general store hurried to her side, covering her with a shawl. "Child, what happened to you?" she asked softly, her voice trembling. The young woman couldn't answer. Her throat was dry, her mind a blur. She just shook her head. The woman frowned, but said nothing more. Around them, whispers spread quickly. Rumors always did. By evening, the sheriff came looking for her. He was a tall man with weary eyes, his badge scratched from years of dust and conflict. He asked her to tell him everything, but when she spoke of the Apache, his face hardened. "You sure it wasn't one of them drifters from the hills?" he asked, as if her words didn't carry enough weight. She told him no, it wasn't a drifter. It was a warrior, quiet and deliberate. He had been waiting inside that barn. The sheriff sighed. "Then we'll have to send riders out to look. Folks won't rest easy knowing one of them is hanging around." His tone carried more suspicion than gratitude. To him, an Apache was never a savior, only a threat. That night, the young woman stayed in the old storekeeper's attic. She couldn't sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw his face, the calmness in his eyes, even as the flames rose behind him. She remembered the way he had said no more. It wasn't anger that filled his voice, but something older, deeper, like he was carrying generations of pain. Outside, the wind rattled the shutters, and she thought she heard the faint sound of drums. Though there was no one out there, she rose from her bed and looked out the window. Beyond the fields, the hills sat dark and quiet. Somewhere out there he was watching, maybe even guarding her still. Days passed, and the town carried on as if nothing had happened. The sheriff and his men rode out, but they came back empty-handed. The 3 men who had attacked her were buried in silence. No one spoke their names. Some said they had gone missing after a fight among themselves. Others whispered about an Indian attack. Twisting the story until it no longer resembled the truth, the woman began helping at the general store, trying to bury her thoughts in work. Yet, she couldn't shake the feeling that the Apache's path and hers were still connected. Every time she heard the creak of the door or caught sight of a shadow moving along the ridge, her heart raced. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills, she stepped outside to gather water. The air was still, the sky painted in red and gold. Then she saw a mark carved into the wooden post by the well. It was a symbol she didn't recognize, but it was deliberate. It looked like 2 crossed lines with a circle between them. She traced it with her fingers, her pulse quickening. Somehow she knew it was from him, a sign that he was near. That night, she couldn't eat. The townsfolk gathered at the saloon, talking in low voices about missing cattle, tracks found near the river, and rumors of a tribe moving closer to the valley. Fear traveled faster than truth, and soon, everyone spoke of raiders and revenge. The sheriff tried to calm them, but no one listened. The people wanted someone to blame, and it wouldn't be long before they looked her way. She decided to leave at dawn, to find the warrior and learn why he had saved her. There was something about the way he appeared, like he had known exactly what would happen. Maybe he had followed those men. Maybe he had been waiting for justice long before she arrived at that barn. When the first light touched the earth, she slipped out quietly, a small bag slung over her shoulder. She took the trail leading toward the hills, the same direction his footprints had gone that night. The land grew wilder with each step, the silence thicker. The smell of pine replaced the dry dust of the valley, and she could hear the faint rush of water somewhere ahead. By midday, she found traces of hemp-broken twigs, a fire pit, and the same carved mark on a nearby tree. She knew she was getting close. Still, a part of her wondered if he would even want to be found. She had heard stories of his kind, of warriors who lived by their own code, unseen and untamed. To them, outsiders brought only ruin. As she climbed higher, the ground turned rocky and the wind grew sharper. She stopped to rest near a ridge, overlooking the valley below. From up there, the world looked vast and quiet, untouched by the noise of men. For the first time, she felt a strange peace, but it didn't last. She heard movement behind her rustle, then silence. Her heart pounded. She turned slowly, her breath catching. He was standing a few yards away, half in shadow, watching her. The same calm in his eyes, the same strength in his stance. Neither spoke for a long time. The wind carried the scent of rain, and thunder rolled faintly in the distance. Finally, she whispered, "I came to thank you." The Apache tilted his head slightly, his expression unreadable. "You should not have followed," he said quietly. "I needed to know why you saved me." He looked past her, toward the valley below. "It was not for you alone," he said. "Those men took what did not belong to them. They burned land that once fed my people. Justice walks slow, but it never forgets." His words hung in the air like smoke. She didn't know how to respond. There was pain in his tone, but also resolve. He turned to leave, but she stepped forward. "They'll come after you," she said. "The town blames you for everything now." He stopped, his back still turned. "Then they will find what they have always feared." The storm clouds gathered over the mountains, the light dimming as thunder echoed again. She realized then that her life was already tied to his, whether she wanted it or not. The land they both stood on carried stories older than any town, stories written in blood and wind. When the first drops of rain began to fall, he looked back at her once more, his eyes softer this time. "Go home," he said. But his voice sounded like a warning and a promise both, as he disappeared into the trees. She stood there, her heart torn between fear and a pull she couldn't explain. The valley below seemed smaller now, filled with lies and smoke. Up here, everything felt real, raw, dangerous, alive. She knew deep inside this was not the end. The fire that had started in that barn was still burning. Only now it was inside both of them. Rain worked into the soil and settled the ash where the barn had stood. The next morning, the town woke to a sodden hush, but it did not last. Word traveled from porch to porch, from the livery to the saloon, and by noon the valley was loud with talk. Some spoke of a ghost who walked out of fire. Others said a woman from nowhere had brought trouble with her. The sheriff said little, which made folks say more. The prairie has a way of filling silence with fear. The storekeeper kept me in the attic, while the street below spun with rumors. She brewed strong coffee and told me to keep my head down. She had lived long enough to know how a crowd looks for a story that matches its anger. When the bell over the shop door rang, I would hold my breath. From the loft window I could see the ridge where I had found the warrior. The clouds sat heavy above it, like a blanket pulled tight across a wound. By evening, a rider came hard from the north. He slid from the saddle, boots splashing through the brown water that ran along the boardwalk. His coat was long and torn. His face had the raw look of someone who had seen the bodies buried after the fire. He said little at first, just tied his horse and stared into the smoky sky. Later I learned he was kin to one of the men from the barn. Not a good man, not a bad one, just a brother carrying the weight of blood. He walked straight to the sheriff and asked for a posse. The sheriff told him to wait. The rider did not like that answer and made sure the saloon heard it in the church. The preacher lit candles and spoke about order and law. He told the town that fear is tinder and rumor is wind. His voice carried through thin walls, a steady sound that tried to calm borrowed fury. But outside the church, boys practiced quick draws with unloaded pistols, and the blacksmith sharpened tools that could easily pass for weapons. It was a place divided between patience and pride, between soil that needed planting and a ridge that felt like it was watching back. That night I dreamed of the symbol carved at the well. 2 lines crossed with a circle between. When I woke, I traced it in the dust on the attic floor. The storekeeper looked at it and frowned, then placed a tin cup over the drawing as if covering an ember. She did not know what it meant, but she told me every marking on this land carries a story. If I wanted to live, I should learn the stories of the people who lived here before fences and deeds. Her words stayed with me the way the warrior's calm had stayed. It all felt connected, like threads pulling through cloth I could not see. At noon, the sheriff called a meeting. He spoke on the steps of the jail with his hat off and the rain ticking at his hair. He said 3 men were dead, a barn gone, and the hills full of questions. He said he would ride toward the river and see what truth could be found. He did not ask for volunteers. The rider from the north stepped forward anyway. So did a ranch hand with a scar across his chin, and a quiet farmer who owed the dead men money he could not pay. I watched from the loft. The storekeeper watched me. What I did not see were the faces in the windows that turned away when I met their eyes. Women who had lost crops to drought, men who had lost sons to accidents and bad luck. The valley was not wicked. It was simply tired. Tired people make sharp choices when offered a simple enemy. An Apache warrior in the hills was a simple enemy. A woman who lived through a fire was a question that did not fit the posters on the wall. Before the posse rode, the sheriff came to the store. He asked the storekeeper for coffee, then asked if I would talk in private. His voice was kind and dry as old wood. He wanted to know about the symbol, about the mark on the tree, about the way the warrior had stood in the barn as if guarding a boundary. I told him everything I remembered. He listened without changes to his face, then thanked me, and set down a small bag of jerked beef in case I was too shaken to cook. I wanted to ask him not to ride. I wanted to tell him the hills were not hunting grounds for men with fresh anger. I said none of it. He left with his hat low and the rain turning to mist. Up in the hills, the warrior moved like weather. He walked the edges of washes and the spines of hard rock. He touched the bark where his mark had been carved and felt the splintered edges where a curious hand had traced it later. He knew a posse would come. He also knew they would not be the only riders. There were others between the town and the river. Traders with long guns. A drifter who sold whiskey to anyone with coin. A pair of soldiers on leave who wanted adventure. He had eyes in all camps, not because he asked, but because those who still held to older ways believed the hills were alive, and a man who listened to them should stay that way. He camped near a spring hidden by scrub oak and cedar. The water came up cold and tasted like iron. Near the spring, half buried by sand, was a circle of stones set by hands now dust. It was a place his mother had brought him as a child and told him stories about an old trail that crossed the valley long before wagons. The circle was not large. It was not grand. But it belonged to a thread of land that ran from the ridge to the river. When the settlers crossed, they cut the thread without seeing it, and the valley changed in ways that maps could not show. The warrior had watched the barn before the fire because word had passed to him that the 3 men meant to make an example of someone who would not join their drives. He had not known it would be me. He had not known their cruelty would catch like straw. He only knew the circle of stones lay in the path of new fences and that a warning had to be given. The warning turned to flames. Fire draws more fire. He accepted that the blame would come because blame always looks for a direction it knows. Back in town, my days settled into a routine with the storekeeper, but my nights refused to be quiet. Each sundown brought different footsteps on the boards below. Some came to buy flour and left with questions. Some came to ask the storekeeper whether she would speak out against me. She did not. She had buried a son years before and believed in mercy because of it. She told them kindness is a stronger fence than any wood. The men nodded. They went back to the saloon where kindness was not on tap. One afternoon, a boy showed up with a sack of eggs for trade. He was thin and fast and spoke with the easy bravery of someone who had never left the valley but had run every inch of it. He told me he had seen riders near the riverbanks at night. He said they were not from the tribe and not from town. He had seen lamps covered with blue cloth to hide the light. He had heard cattle move when no one was supposed to be herding. The boy shrugged and said, maybe folks were stealing from both sides and letting fear do the hiding. Then he grinned and asked for hard candy. I gave him 2. When he left, the storekeeper said a child's truth often stands. Where grown men refused to look, that night the preacher knocked on the back door. He asked if he could speak with me. His hand shook a little. He said he had no right to ask questions, but he needed to know whether the warrior had looked at me with hate or with something else. I told him about the way the warrior had said no more. I told him the words sounded like an oath to the land, not a threat to a person. The preacher nodded and took off his hat. He said if the hills had a voice, it would not shout. It would stand still and say that line. He said there were elders who remembered treaties no one else cared to remember. He said the sheriff knew some of it, but could not say it out loud without losing his job. The posse returned at dusk on the third day. Dusk gray and quiet. They had seen smoke near the river, but no camp. They had found tracks that faded into stone, and tracks that led nowhere at all. The rider from the north was not with them. He had turned off at a fork, following his brother's memory instead of the sheriff's order. The town breathed out in relief at the sight of the sheriff, then breathed in again when he said nothing about justice being done. The saloon went loud that night. The quiet houses got quieter. I could not sit with it. Before dawn, I packed a small bundle. I left a note for the storekeeper that said I was going to learn the stories she spoke about. Then, I slipped through the alley and headed for the ridge. I wore a coat the sheriff had left behind years back, a thing too big and smelling of sun and tobacco. The grass brushed at my knees. The sky was wide and pale. A hawk turned circles above me, slow and sure, as if measuring the pace of a heart. Midway to the hills, I found a fence that ran where it had not run before. New posts with fresh pine smell. Beyond the fence ran a creek fed by hidden springs. Someone had pinned a paper to one of the posts, too clean to have been there long. I unfolded it and read words about a claim filed in town by a ranch company whose letterhead showed far-off offices. The paper described a boundary from the ridge to the river, straight as a surveyor's dream. It crossed the creek and cut through the ground, where the elder stones likely rested. I felt the push of why the warrior had watched the barn. This was not just about a night of cruelty. It was about a thread across the valley being pulled hard by hands that did not live here. On the far side of the creek, I found the mark again. 2 lines crossed with a circle between. It had been cut into an old fence rail long before the new posts went up. The cut had weathered and turned silver. It felt less like a warning here and more like a map. I followed the rail as it dipped and rose. It led me to the cedar hollow in the spring, quiet and clear, with a rim of black stones I had not seen since childhood in a different place. I knelt and touched the water. It was cold and iron-sweet, like breath after a run. I felt the presence of someone before I heard him. The warrior stood across the spring with his hands open and empty. His eyes went from me to the new line of fence in the distance. I told him about the paper and the company name and the boy who had seen lamps by the river. He listened the way he had fought, without wasted motion. When I finished, he said there were men who wore town clothes in daylight and masks at night, and that they were gathering cattle from both sides and pushing them through the canyon where the river ran narrow. They were stealing from the tribe and the ranchers and letting the anger fall on the oldest target. He said the barn had been used to trade favors, to store what was taken, to hold fear as a kind of coin. I asked if the sheriff knew. He said the sheriff suspected but did not want a war. I asked whether we could prove it. He looked toward the canyon and said proof has to be seen by eyes that want to see. We heard hoofbeats then. Not close, but not far. The warrior stepped back into shadow. He told me to return to town by a different path and act as if we had not met. He said the rider from the north had made friends with men who liked to blame rather than work, that those men would follow the creek soon. He said if the posse came again, there would be a fight the valley would not forget. I told him I would not carry more silence. He told me silence protects until it burns. I started back along the dry wash. The land seemed to breathe, the way a chest rises before a shout. Beyond the wash I saw shapes moving, slow and careful, keeping to the cottonwoods. I recognized the rider's long coat and the set of his shoulders bent by grief. With him were men whose horses wore blankets the color of night. One carried a lariat tied in a loop too neat for honest work. Another had a lantern wrapped in blue cloth, even though the day was wide. They stopped at the new fence and studied the paper on the post. Then they looked toward the ridge and the hollow where the spring lay hidden. I moved lower into the brush. My hands were steady, but my breath was not. A meadowlark sang from a fence post with a song so clear it hurt. The men dismounted and checked their rifles. The rider from the north tied down his horse and started toward the cedar hollow with steps that looked like a prayer that had lost its words. Behind me, in the shadow of the trees, a quiet voice said my name. I turned and found the sheriff with mud on his boots and worry in his eyes. He put a finger to his lips and pointed toward the men by the fence. He had followed them, not because he trusted them, but because he did not. He looked past me toward the spring where the warrior waited. The sheriff's jaw tightened. He whispered that a wagon was hidden in the canyon with brands burned and covered by tar, and that someone important would be there by nightfall to move the herd. He whispered that if the warrior and the rider crossed paths now, the truth would die before anyone heard it. I asked him what we were supposed to do. He did not answer. He was watching the men by the fence and counting, and I could see the moment he realized there were more horses in the cottonwoods than he had guessed. He drew a slow breath and lifted his hand, not toward his gun, but toward the sky. As if asking the clouds for time, from the cedar hollow came a sound like a single footstep on stone. The rider from the north heard it. He turned his head, eyes narrowing. His hand went to the rifle across his chest. The men with him spread out, thin line, across open ground. Between the ridge and the fence, between the spring and the cottonwoods, the valley held still, waiting to see which story would claim it. The valley held its breath as the rider from the north raised his rifle, the barrel glinting in the weak afternoon light. The men behind him fanned out, boots sinking into wet soil, their coats flapping in the rising wind. Somewhere beyond the ridge, thunder grumbled, as if the storm itself was waiting for what was about to unfold. I crouched beside the sheriff, my heart thudding so loud I was sure they would hear it. He motioned for me to stay still, his hand resting near his gun, but not drawing it yet. The air between both sides was thick. It's a kind of silence that only happens before something breaks. The warrior stood half hidden by the cedar trees, unmoving, his face unreadable. He seemed to melt into the earth, like part of it. The creek ran between him and the Monero, but deep, the water black with shadow. For a moment, I thought maybe they would turn back. Maybe they would realize the land didn't want more blood. But then one of them shouted, "There!" by the spring, and chaos began. The first shot cracked through the valley. Birds scattered from the trees, and the echo rolled off the ridge. The warrior dropped low, the bullet slicing bark behind him. He moved fast, faster than I could follow, slipping between rocks and roots. The sheriff cursed under his breath and took cover beside me. "They'll burn the whole valley to find him," he whispered. "They don't care what truth they hit along the way." The rider from the north shouted orders, his voice sharp with rage. I could see it on his face. This wasn't just about justice. It was about revenge. The kind that blinds a man until all he sees is the reflection of his own anger. He fired again and again, hitting nothing but water and trees. The warrior didn't shoot back. He only moved, silent as shadow, trying to draw them away from the spring. The sheriff finally stepped out, raising his hand. "Hold your fire," he shouted. "This isn't your land to claim." But no one listened. The men were too deep in their fury, their boots churning mud as they advanced. The wind picked up, carrying dust and rain together. The storm was closing in. I crawled closer to the creek, desperate to see. The warrior had taken cover behind a boulder near the old stone circle. His knife gleamed for a second, then vanished as he ducked low. One of the men tried to cross the water, slipping on the slick rocks. The warrior moved in a flash one motion, fast and precise. The man fell back, his weapon skidding into the current. The others froze, suddenly aware that they weren't hunting, they were being watched. It's measured, outmatched. The sheriff aimed into the air and fired once, a warning shot. The sound cut through the shouting. "Enough," he yelled. "You'll bring hell on us all." The men hesitated, but the rider turned on him, eyes burning. "You protect him?" he barked. "After what he did? After what he took?" The sheriff didn't lower his gun. "What he took was his right. What your brother did burned that right into ash." The rider's jaw tightened. The truth hit him like a blow, but pride wouldn't let him back down. "You weren't there," he said through his teeth. "You didn't see what he left behind. Before the sheriff could answer, thunder crashed above us, shaking the ground. The rain came hard, soaking everything in seconds. The creek swelled, turning wild and fast. The horses reared, spooked by lightning that split the sky. The men scattered for cover, their shouts lost in the storm. I ran toward the spring, my feet slipping in the mud. The sheriff shouted after me, but I didn't stop. The warrior was still there, crouched beside the stones, watching the water rise. His eyes met mine across the storm. There was something in them, not fear, not anger, but a strange calm, like he had seen all this before. "You have to go," I shouted over the rain. "They won't stop." He shook his head. "They will not leave until they see what the fire hides." His voice was steady, even as lightning flashed again. He pointed toward the rocks near the creek bed, where part of the earth had washed away. Beneath the roots, half buried, was a small wooden chest, weathered and cracked. "They fight for lies," he said. "That box holds the truth." I stared at it, barely hearing him over the storm. "What's in it?" "Proof," he said. "The map. The treaty. The land they steal again." It's made sense now. The stolen cattle, the secret fences, the men sneaking through the canyon. It wasn't about revenge. It was about land and greed dressed up as justice. The barn hadn't just been a crime, it had been a meeting place for a theft that reached far beyond the valley. The warrior wasn't fighting for blood. He was fighting for memory. Before I could speak, a gunshot ripped through the rain. The bullet struck the ground near the warrior's feet, spraying mud. The rider from the north had found us. His hat was gone, his face streaked with water and fury. "Step away from her," he yelled. "Step away from that box." The warrior rose slowly, his knife glinting in the stormlight. The two men stared at each other across the creek, history and hatred written in their silence. I could see both of them trembling, not from fear, but from everything they carried. The storm roared around them. I felt the whole valley holding its breath again. The sheriff appeared behind the rider, his gun drawn. "Don't do this," he said, his voice heavy. "You'll drown in your own anger before you find what you're looking for." But the rider didn't hear him more, didn't care. He fired once more. The warrior moved aside, the shot grazing his arm. He didn't flinch. He just took a step forward, into the rain. The creek was rising fast, water churning brown and cold. The warrior crossed it in 2 strides, the current pulling at his legs. The rider stumbled back, trying to reload, his fingers slick with rain. Lightning split the sky again. And for one heartbeat, everything froze, the storm, the men, even time itself. Then another sound cut through the chaos, a horn. Faint but steady, coming from the direction of the canyon. The sheriff turned sharply. "The company wagons," he said under his breath. "They're moving the herd." The rider hesitated, glancing toward the sound. In that second, the warrior reached him, grabbing his wrist. The rifle fell into the mud. They stood locked together, the rain pouring down their faces. "Look," the warrior said quietly. "See what you fight for?" The rider's eyes flicked toward the ridge where the lanterns now glowed faintly in the distance, blue cloth lights. The same ones the boy had seen. A long line of wagons crept through the canyon, covered with tarps to hide stolen brands. The truth was right there, shining through the rain, undeniable. But truth has a cost, and I could see him fighting it inside. Torn between rage and reason, the sheriff called out again, his voice barely carrying. "If you want justice, help us stop them." For a moment, I thought the rider might listen. But the storm was too loud, the years of hate too deep. He pulled free, stumbled back toward his men, shouting orders. The warrior watched him go, then turned to me. "The proof must reach the town," he said. "Before they twist it again?" I looked at the chest half buried in the mud. "You can't go alone," I said. "They'll kill you before you reach the valley." He didn't answer. He just lifted the box, cradling it under one arm like something sacred, and nodded toward the ridge. "The river will rise. The storm will cover our trail." The sheriff joined us, breathing hard, mud streaked across his face. "He's right," he said. "They'll never see you through this weather. But once the sky clears, The whole town will burn if we don't show them what's true." Thunder cracked again, closer this time. The creek was spilling over, flooding the path. The warrior climbed the rocks toward higher ground, his figure a dark silhouette against the storm. I followed, clutching the sheriff's hand as we pulled ourselves up the slope. Below us, the rider and his men regrouped, their lanterns bobbing like willow wisps in the darkness. When we reached the top, the valley spread wide and wild beneath us. The rain fell harder, but through the sheets of water, I could still see the faint glow of the town in the distance. The warrior stopped, turning to look back one last time. His eyes met mine, and even in the storm, I could see the question there, not whether we could survive this, but whether the truth would. The wind howled through the canyon, and the wagons below began to move faster, trying to outrun the flood. The sheriff raised his rifle, aiming toward the lead wagon. "If they cross that bridge, the proof means nothing," he said. I saw his finger tighten on the trigger, then pause. His voice dropped low, steady despite the storm. "This ends tonight. One way or another." Lightning flashed again, lighting up the valley like day. For a split second, everything stood clear, the warrior on the ridge, the sheriff beside him, the rider below, shouting orders, and the stolen wagons grinding through the mud. All of it framed in white fire. Then the thunder rolled, and the world fell back into shadow. The storm was about to break. And with it, everything we thought we knew. The rain finally began to ease as dawn crept over the valley. The storm that had raged through the night left the land washed clean and raw, the sky streaked with soft light. Smoke rose faintly from the soaked earth, and the sound of rushing water filled the canyons where the river had swelled. The chaos of the night before had passed, but the valley still trembled with what it had witnessed. The truth had been forced out of the shadows, and now the land itself seemed to wait. Holding its breath for what would come next, the sheriff stood at the ridge, his coat torn and his hat gone, staring down at the ruined trail below. The wagons that had carried the stolen cattle and papers lay overturned near the riverbank, washed by the flood. A few of the company men had fled, while others lay trapped in the mud, their schemes drowned with the storm. The sheriff lowered his rifle, his voice rough but steady. "It's over," he said quietly, more to himself than anyone else. "The valley's taken back what was hers." Beside him, the warrior rested against a rock, blood seeping from a wound on his arm, but his eyes still sharp. The wooden chest lay at his feet, its lock broken, the papers inside still safe under a layer of cloth. He had risked everything to protect them, the treaty, the old boundary marks. The proof that the land had once belonged to his people long before the fences and deeds of the settlers. The truth had always been buried, but now it was in the open, undeniable. The fight wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about remembrance and peace. I moved closer, wrapping my shawl tighter around me. The morning air was cold, but something inside me felt lighter than it had in months. "You did it," I said softly. "You kept your word." The warrior looked at me, his expression calm. "No," he said. "The land kept its word. It remembers when men forget." His voice carried the quiet strength of someone who had seen too much loss and still chose to protect what little good remained. The sheriff crouched near the chest, lifting one of the documents carefully. The paper was old, edges yellowed, but clear enough to read. "This," he said, "will change everything. When the judge sees this, those ranch companies won't have a claim left. The fences, the herds, the land deeds, they'll all fall apart." "But will they listen?" I asked. "The town believes what it wants to believe." He looked up, meeting my eyes. "They'll listen because I'll make them. I've lived long enough in this place to know when the wind's about to change." He glanced toward the warrior. "And maybe it's time someone else spoke for the land." By midday, we made our way back toward the town. The sun broke through the clouds, drying the roads and glinting off puddles like shards of glass. The air smelled of wet earth and pine. As we walked, the warrior stayed a few paces behind, silent but watchful. Every now and then, I looked back and caught his gaze. It wasn't pride or defiance, but something softer, almost peaceful. He had carried his duty to the end when we reached the edge of town. People began to gather, drawn by the sight of the sheriff's muddy horse and the strange company he brought with him. Whispers ran through the crowd, but this time they didn't come with scorn. They came with curiosity and something like shame. The preacher stepped out first, his hands folded, eyes wide as he took in the chest. "Is it true?" he asked. "All that talk of theft and deceit?" The sheriff nodded and handed him one of the papers. "True enough to rewrite every story told in this valley." By afternoon, the church was filled with townsfolk. The sheriff laid the documents on the altar for all to see, and the preacher read them aloud, proof of the treaty, signed generations ago between the local Apache band and the first settlers, granting shared use of the land, protection of the spring, and respect for sacred ground. The ink was faded, but the words clear. The truth was older than any of their greed. Some faces turned pale. Others bowed their heads. The rider from the north wasn't among them. He had left before dawn, his anger too heavy for the daylight. The sheriff didn't speak ill of him. He only said, "Sometimes grief blinds a man until he can't see what's worth saving." The townsfolk sat in silence after the reading. For once, no one argued, no one shouted. It was as if the storm had washed the lies clean out of them. The storekeeper, who had once sheltered me, stood and spoke first. "Then it's time we fix what's broken," she said firmly. "The fences, the words, the way we treat one another. We can start by honoring this paper and the people it belongs to." The preacher nodded. "The land doesn't belong to one side or the other," he said softly. "It belongs to those who care for it." The sheriff turned toward the warrior, who stood quietly at the back of the room. "You'll be needing a voice in this town," he said. "Someone to see the law doesn't twist again." The warrior shook his head slowly. "I do not speak for all, but I will teach those who wish to learn." From that day, things began to shift. The ranch companies pulled out, their false claims exposed. The stolen cattle were returned, the fences near the spring taken down. The sheriff arranged for a new council, half settlers, half Apache elders, to decide on how the land would be used. It wasn't a perfect peace, but it was a beginning. I stayed in town for a while, helping at the store again, though now the customers came with softer voices and fewer stares. Sometimes they asked about that night, the fire, the storm, the warrior. I told them what mattered, not in detail but in spirit. That courage doesn't always come with a gun or a shout. Sometimes it walks quietly, waits patiently, and stands firm when others fall. One evening, weeks later, I rode up toward the ridge again. The valley below shimmered in the golden light of sunset, and the wind carried the scent of sage. The old barn's ashes were gone, covered by new grass. Life had returned to the place where fear once ruled. I found the warrior there, tending to a young horse near the spring. He looked up as I approached, his face calm as ever. "You came back," he said. "I had to," I replied, "to see if peace really took root." We smiled faintly. "Peace is like the river," he said. "It bends, it floods, but it always finds its way." I dismounted and stood beside him, watching the water flow. "The town's changing," I said. "The sheriff's keeping his word. They're rebuilding the church roof next week. The preacher's teaching both languages now. Children run near the store without fear." "That is good," he said quietly. The valley breathes again. We stood there for a long while, listening to the sound of water and wind. The world felt wide and kind, as if the land itself had forgiven us. I looked at him and asked, "Will you stay here?" He nodded. "This is my home. My mother's spirit rests in the hills. The stories are still here. I will keep them alive." I smiled, feeling a warmth rise in my chest. "Then I'll stay too," I said. "Someone needs to write them down." He looked at me then, the corners of his mouth lifting. "Then we both keep watch." As the sun slipped behind the ridge, the valley turned gold, and the sky deepened into a soft blue. The wind carried the scent of rain that was no longer threatening but cleansing. I knew that even though scars remained, they were part of the story, the kind that made the land richer, stronger. The next morning, the town gathered again. Not for judgment, but for celebration. The sheriff read the new agreement aloud, one that honored both the settlers and the Apache. The preacher blessed the spring as a shared place of gathering. Children played nearby, splashing in the clean water while their parents watched, smiling. The warrior stood at the edge of the crowd, quiet but proud. His presence a bridge between two worlds that had nearly destroyed each other. When it was done, he met my eyes across the field and nodded once. It was not a farewell, but a promise that the land would never fall silent again. Years later, people would still talk about that storm to fire, the truth, and the man who stood against 3 rifles with nothing but courage and the land behind him. They would tell it as a story of justice, of a valley saved not by anger but by understanding. And when the wind moved through the grass near the old barn, it would carry the whisper of that night, the sound of rain, the echo of thunder, and the faint voice of the land saying once more, no more peace had come to the valley at last, not as a gift, but as something earned. And under the endless western sky, the people learned to live again, side by side, in the place that finally belonged to all of them,